From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, and I'd like to welcome you to our podcast series about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. I'll be joined today by my producer and co-host, Alfred Turner.
Today, we're going to talk with two guests who are working to bring the history of the civil rights movement to life in a recently founded museum in Orangeburg, South Carolina.
Acclaimed civil rights photographer Cecil Williams, founder of the Cecil Williams South Carolina Civil Rights Museum, joins us along with Jannie Harriot, the museum's executive director. Cecil began photographing the events and people of the civil rights era in the early 1950s and continued through the 1970s, eventually amassing nearly 1 million images. Now, in 2023, he and Jannie are committed to community engagement. We recently talked with them about the civil rights movement, the importance of South Carolina in that movement, and their efforts to build a new home for the museum. Today, my guests are Cecil Williams, the legendary photographer, not just of the civil rights movement in South Carolina, but the entire American South, and Miss Jannie Harriot, who is the executive director of a new museum in Orangeburg, the Cecil Williams South Carolina Civil Rights Museum. And Mr. Williams, you and your wife put up the money to get this museum started, didn't you?
I guess we were a little naive in thinking that we know that museums cost millions of dollars. Terrific urge and really a responsibility to try and preserve history. It was, again, a 30-year obsession of mine to preserve the history and the experiences and the events that I have personally witnessed and photographed.
How many photographs have you taken over the course of your career with regard to the civil rights movement? Because you're going back to the 1960s, so we're talking about at least a half century.
In starting at 9 years old, I think that I've probably taken about 10,000 pictures a year. So quite a bit. I'm 85 years old now, and quite a few number of pictures since then.
So do you still physically have, a 500,000 negatives?
Probably it's a terrific task to begin to count them. And also, I did not keep very good records during those days, so it would be quite a task.
Ms. Harriot, do you plan to that? How long have you been with the museum?
I started with the museum in November of 21, thinking that I was just going to watch Cecil do his thing. As you know, I had been the chairman of the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission for a number of years. And when my appointment was up, as I told Cecil, I just want to watch TV. And he said, "No, Jannie, I have something for you to do." So since November of 21, I've been working with Cecil.
Well, your program director, are you helping him catalog too, or is that just that's his area?
That's the area of someone we are trying to bring on board, because Cecil does I think there are more than 1 million images in that museum.
Goodness.
And Dr. Bobby Donaldson is helping us with that. And basically what I do is look for funding for programming and direct the programs that we have at the museum and that we conduct across the state.
Okay, and that's a part of the story I want to get into, but I want to get back to, you opened the museum. It's a small building right now on the outskirts of Orangeburg, right?
Yes, in a residential area, in fact, a former home that my wife and I lived in. I was not able to go to Clemson coming up out of high school. I wanted to be an architect at one time in my life, so in my lifetime I have designed 3 buildings. It turns out that the building we started the museum in was available next door to where I lived, and it was a pretty good starting point to begin the museum, which we started in 2019. My sister, Brenda, my wife, and I really are the founders of the museum. We did it with about $60,000, but again, we had the archives, the photographs, and a lot of documents, so we had a kind of a head start in that way.
Ms. Harriot said one of her jobs was getting funding.
Since I started with Cecil in November of 21, it's now about $1.5 million.
Oh, wow.
Because we have a number of programs that we run that are funded, one by the Arts Commission, one by the 1772 Foundation, and so we're getting there.
Part of the money that you're going to be getting is a federal grant. Congressman James Clyburn got that in the federal budget. The General Assembly appropriated $250,000. And now you're looking at a new building in downtown Orangeburg. And when I saw the address, Magnolia and Russell Streets, I thought if you wanted to get an intersection of South Carolina and the civil rights history, you couldn't have picked a better location.
That's true. And the funding that Congressman Clyburn had allocated is for that particular site. It's not necessarily for the museum, but for a museum in the old State Theater. And so we've been working with the city of Orangeburg, and the funding is through USDA to see how best those funds can be used.
Well, I want to know, before we go forward, why is that intersection, that area, significant, Walter, or anybody?
That intersection, when you deal with the civil rights movement in Orangeburg, near that location, of course, is the bowling alley where protests started that ended up in the Orangeburg massacre. But those were the streets that run by South Carolina State College and Claflin University. So you could say in Orangeburg itself, almost the nexus of the civil rights movement.
It's important to know that, again, you don't stand in a void in this country or in any community. You stand on someone else's shoulders, and surely the advances for African Americans in Orangeburg and in South Carolina, America, happened because someone else stood up and made sacrifices to make those changes possible. And certainly a lot of that, in fact, part of the catalyst of America is shared with Clarendon County and, of course, Orangeburg as well as being first and second waves of change in American history.
And when you talk about Clarendon County, you're talking about the Briggs case, which eventually became a part of the 1954 Supreme Court decision.
And that's Briggs v. Elliott, right?
Right.
And initially about getting a school bus, wasn't it?
It started off, well, there were two cases. The one that was to get a school bus, and that case got thrown out on a technicality. But then the Briggs case came in asking for equal funding for African-American children in the small school district in Clarendon County, and that with the support of the NAACP, and it was actually a new effort for them because they've been looking at colleges. They got involved. Thurgood Marshall came to South Carolina, and it was tried in district court in Charleston, and that's when the judge, the South Carolina native-born judge, said segregation per se is discrimination.
Judge Wadis Waring?
Judge Wadis Waring.
Yes, the Briggs versus Elliott case is very important to our museum and the collections we have there. In fact, as you walk into the front entrance of our museum, it is prominently displayed and represented with photographs that I took because I became involved with the Briggs case very early on at 12 and 13 and 14. My mother, in fact, taught for the Reverend J. Lane, the AME, Allen University graduate and minister who really gathered the ministers together and who worked very closely with Thurgood Marshall. It was also my great pleasure, and I look upon it as a moment of pride, that on one of the trips to South Carolina, to Charleston, the president of the NAACP took me to photograph Thurgood Marshall arriving on the train. And so I took one photograph, and of course that photograph is in many history books today.
And you were how old, 12?
12, 13, or 14. Sometimes I get the exact day. I didn't take very good records during those days and mark my information on the envelopes. And there's so many of my images that, again, of kind of a guess as to exactly when they were taken.
As a young man, what kind of camera did you have?
At 9 years old, my brother had the camera in the house, a Kodak Baby Brownie Special. Cost $2.25 from Sears Roebuck. And after he grew tired and took an interest in music, he gave the camera to me. I immediately became addicted to it. On Sundays, I would go to Edisto Gardens in Orangeburg and charge people $1 for taking a picture. I got them developed. Later, I had a home-based darkroom. But I made a little profit, and so the financial incentive, I guess, of taking pictures and being able to make money is what drove me deeper and deeper into photography and other cameras as well.
So literally, you started off taking these famous photographs with a very basic camera that any young person growing up in the country could relate to.
Yes, during those days of film and film-based photography, of course, it was very difficult because in addition to having to use film in the cameras, you'd have to develop the film and carry it through a chemistry process and then develop the photograph. So it was quite complicated. And when digital came along, I was one of the first adopters of that because, again, it cut out so much and saved so much time.
Mr. Williams, during the civil rights movement, as you were recording this, did you have any issues with the police seizing your camera, trying to destroy your camera, which, you know, we saw when that happened in Birmingham, but I just was curious if you had had any of those experiences.
Well, I grew up and my education took place right during the middle of the civil rights movement era. I generally define that as the period between 1950 and 1970. And, of course, this is the period when I'm pursuing my education. And I marched and demonstrated as other students did, but I always had my camera with me. Many times I would step out of position in the marching and get in front of them and photograph them. But I was arrested twice for attempting to take photographs, in fact, in downtown Orangeburg, but was bailed out in about an hour and did not endure some of the indignities that many of my fellow students did by staying in jail much longer.
Did they ever seize your photograph or destroy your rolls of film, that kind of thing?
Both times that I was arrested, they took the film out of my camera and then threw my cameras in the trunk of their car. I reacted very poorly, I'm sure, because, again, I knew that not only was my camera perhaps damaged, but also my film was destroyed.
Were you able to retrieve your cameras?
I was able to retrieve my cameras, but the film was, of course, ruined and being exposed to light, yes.
Okay. And see, that's part of the story that I think young people today don't know anything about.
Well, it's still happening very much today. My nephew, who happens to be a reporter for The Guardian and The Griot, during the George Floyd incident in Birmingham, where he lived, he was covering the story. He and several other reporters were covering the story. They arrested him. So it hasn't stopped.
Let's get back to the museum. The plans that you've been working with the city of Orangeburg, and Ms. Harriot, this is really kind of your area now. It's a fairly large piece of property, and it's going to have, as they say, multi-purpose usage. The museum there's a place for cultural activities, which is the museum, but there's going to be housing, stores, that kind of thing.
Right. It is multi-purpose, and the space that's allotted for the museum is really not enough space. Because we have so much, but it's the old State Theater there at the corner, the railroad corner. And so the plan is to have the museum move in there. It's limited in what we can do because there's no place for programming, which is very important to museums. So we're looking at how we can make those adjustments. We're going to be meeting with the developers and the city of Orangeburg to see what can be done so that we don't just move from a space to another space and still not be able to have an opportunity to show off all of the works that we have, as well as to develop and present programming.
Now, was the State Theater a segregated theater?
I'm going to let Cecil answer.
Yes, as a child, that was a very popular place. In fact, the only place in town that I could go and see the movies, Tom Mix, The Lone Ranger, Superman, Batman, Robin. 10 cents on a Saturday was a field day. I would get a bag of popcorn and spend the entire day there looking at the serials where the main characters would come near to maybe being destroyed, and then at the last minute they would be rescued. But also, this area, of course, is a very historical place. But I want to also inform our audience that where we are now is a workable museum. We've had 11,000 people since 2019 to come to the museum that is open today. In fact, in the month of February, we recorded over 1,100 persons that visit the museum, about 35 to 40% of them middle to high school, and then the other, of course, middle age and, of course, senior citizens.
So what is the address for that?
The address of our museum today is 1865 Lake Drive. It is in the residential area right off of Highway 301. However, it's only 4 miles from Interstate 26. So even though it's not suitable as we would like it to be, it is a workable museum, a museum that where we have been able to put about 1/3 of the documents, artifacts, and manuscripts that we have that tell this great story.
And Walter, we should probably mention they have a website, and there is a virtual tour of the museum. What's the website address?
The website is cecilwilliams.com, and the website also includes on it links to other places of interest. We can't be selfish with this history. South Carolina has not really been all through history recognized having the great leadership roles that we did as really being a leader or really being prominent when it comes down to civil rights history. We're trying to change that. We're trying to preserve a history that we feel there's a very important part. We played a very important role in American history, and we want that to be known and respected.
All right, what about the museum? Self-guided tour, or do you have a volunteer docent take people through the museum, or how does that work?
Not having a full-time staff right now, we do everything by appointment, usually twice a day, 10:30 and 2:30. We invite individuals to come to us, but we do like them to make an appointment to make sure. I try to give our visitors a one-on-one, 5-minute visual overview because our history is a little different and maybe different from what they have maybe been taught. We feel that, of course, given the respect that the Reverend Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, and how important they were, and they, of course, are also present in our museum and their histories. But South Carolina's role is what we emphasize from the standpoint of really the beginning is in the catalyst stage of a movement that was going on. Most people know of the importance of Montgomery, Alabama, but we had a lot of things happening here in South Carolina that we feel even happened before Montgomery, Alabama.
I was going to say there was a bus boycott in Columbia and Rock Hill before there was one in Montgomery.
Yes, and Sarah Mae Fleming from Eastover, we have her history also prominently displayed in the museum. But her role is not very much told about in our history books. But we want all this history to be known. We don't think it should be exclusive and just known to a few. But we're fighting against time. I'm in my 80s. Again, we want to, in our lifetime and in Jannie's lifetime, be able to preserve this history so that it will not be forgotten and so that it can be permanently etched as a part of a great role that we played in the American Civil Rights Movement period.
All right. You mentioned Dr. Bobby Donaldson, who is director of the Civil Rights Institute at the University of South Carolina. Do you have any kind of formal relationship with them or with State or Claflin?
Dr. Bobby Donaldson is one of our most important friends to the museum. He has done so much, having founded the Civil Rights Center at the University of South Carolina, a good friend, but he's also on our board of directors, and we lean upon him very heavily, bug him probably quite a bit too, because, again, he has helped to really put South Carolina on the map. So we look upon him as a friend, as we do with other historians. For example, at Clemson University, Dr. Vernon Burton, a Lincoln scholar, is on our board of directors, and also a confidant and also a person that we rely on for counseling and to keep us right on target with our histories. And also Dr. Larry Watson, also connected, I think, with USC today and formerly of South Carolina State University. But we have, in fact, a very illustrious board, people who help guide us in the right direction as we are going down this journey of establishing a civil rights museum in South Carolina.
Ms. Harriot?
We approached the South Carolina Arts Commission, I guess, almost as soon as I came on board because I've had a relationship with them over the years. So we have a project where we are able to take these images. It's called our Arts and Education series, where we're able to take these images to schools and we can actually give them to the schools, give them to the students. We call them our poster series. That's an ongoing project, and we've been funded for 2 years. We're nearing the end of the first year. Then the 1772 Foundation again came in.
Would you explain what is the 1772
1772 Foundation is a foundation out of Connecticut that somehow I got connected to several years ago working with Joe McGill. And it is a philanthropic organization that funds projects across the country. The first project that I was aware of was they funded Joseph McGill's slave dwelling project. And then they funded some teachers to be a part of a teacher institute that I developed at Penn Center several years ago. So they're prominent in terms of what they do across the country. Of course, we have other funders. South Carolina Humanities is one of our funders, and a number of corporate organizations as well. So we're always beating the bushes.
With any cultural organization, that is a never-ending task. But I just keep thinking, with the richness of this collection, I'd like to see all million images online.
Well, at Claflin University, we were also very fortunate, even before we started the museum, the Gaylord Donnelly Foundation at Claflin funded a project where, under President Henry Tisdale, the former president of Claflin University, he allowed us to set up a laboratory in the library, and we trained students to digitize my film. So that was of great help. And, of course, now at this point, nearly 5 years after that project started, we have just about digitized all of my films. So now the next big challenge lies in front of us, identifying them and adding the metadata.
Our history is important to us because if you don't know where you came from, you might not know where you're going.
That's very true. Or why you're here.
Exactly.
Yes.
Alfred?
Well, I was going to say that one thing that strikes me about all of this is it's community history.
Yes.
And community history, or local history as we've sometimes referred to it on the show, is the basis of everything in your community. How did I get here? Why are things the way they are? How much have things changed since my mother or my grandmother told me about them? That can be community history, but as you've pointed out, Cecil, talking about particularly Briggs v. Elliott, even the big national historical events come back to communities. And hearing you talk about, Jannie, about the fact that not all of his history is known, nor was it even well published in its time, it needs advocates to get it out there, which I think is just extraordinary that you guys are doing this. So kudos to you.
Our task in documenting our history and making our museum was somewhat aided by the fact that in 1999, I published a journalistic book, a documentary.
It's on my library shelf.
Wonderful. Thank you. Freedom and Justice,
Yes.
published by Mercer University. And since then, they have done 3 other books. I'd also like to mention now that USC Press will be shortly releasing a new book done by, again, a former state newspaper reporter, Ms. Claudia Brimson. I was very happy to do a joint project with her, and over about a 3-year period, we interviewed and put that book together, and I think it's going to be coming out towards the end of the year. The name of it, I believe, is Injustice in Focus, the Civil Rights Photographer, Cecil Williams. But it was easy to use these books as a guideline to make the exhibits and put the exhibits on the wall and to highlight the important thing. Of course, we can't do everything. The concept of the museum is really to invite others. You see, South Carolina was, of the 16 southern states, the only state that did not have a civil rights museum. We thought this was so important to bring this history forward, to make a museum, and we're inviting others to become a part of it. We need partners. We would love to partner or coalition to really make this happen. We can't do it alone. We invite the public to also contribute artifacts. Artifacts also help to tell the story. One of the most valuable and historically significant items in the museum is the Briggs Family Bible. That was the Bible that was in the Briggs family household at the time they were undergoing the turmoil that happened after they signed that case in the backward and rural community of Clarendon County, Summerton, South Carolina. Again, they lost their jobs. They had to move out of the state. But their faith carried them through. Since then, we have also collected and have on display the Reverend J.A. Delane Bible, and also the Briggs Bible. Also the Pearson Bible. So we have the Briggs, Delane, and the Pearson Bibles encased and, of course, safely archived so that everyone can see these great artifacts, yes, but more personal history Bibles that, again, enable these people to have the faith to withstand all the challenges they were facing as they signed that Briggs versus Elliott petition back in the 1950s. The Topeka, Kansas case is the case that, of course, has the namesake. But as the Briggs versus Elliott was the first case in history to attack segregation in public education.
Well, I have to say, it is time to wrap up. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's my job, Walter. It's my job.
I know it's your job. See, I didn't look and I didn't see you twirling your finger.
Well, I wasn't, because now I get to talk to you, unlike our days on the radio.
All right. Well, I would like to thank Jannie Harriot and Cecil Williams for being with us today to talk about the Civil Rights Museum in Orangeburg and the history of civil rights in the state of South Carolina. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
It's been wonderful to be here with you, and please invite us again.
I hope you enjoyed today's journal. I know that I did. I've known both Cecil Williams and Jannie Harriot for quite some time, and the efforts of both of these two outstanding South Carolinians to educate South Carolinians and Americans about the civil rights movement in South Carolina is an important contribution to the history of our state and our country.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. As always, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. We'll talk again soon.